Hi, this is Steve Florison. This is Unit 8, Engage Respectfully with Young People. You can see here some of the themes. Australia's young people, listening to young people, rapport, cross-cultural youth, youth culture, those sort of things. There's two assessments in this unit. There's a knowledge-based written assessment and there's a project where you draw up a one-week program. When you look at definitions of youth or young people, there's a lot of definitions out there. But when you use the terms youth, adolescent, teenager, young person, it's really that time of life that's neither childhood nor adulthood. And the United Nations describes that as somewhere between 15 and 25 years old, that period of life. It's interesting to see how Australian youth culture has changed over the years. And when I think about that, I think about two films. The first of these is Puberty Blues, which came out in the late 70s, early 80s. And this was a very carefree, innocent view of Australian youth. You know, the beach culture, Bondi, the rivalry between the girls and that sort of thing. And then I look at this movie here. This is called Wasted on the Young, and it was made in Western Australia a few years ago. And this is a very hard-edged movie. It's got tough themes in it, like suicide, cyberbullying, using phones to video fights, all that sort of thing. And when I look at those two movies and you see the transition in youth culture over the years, you probably think that it is a lot tougher for young people these days than it was in the times when we grew up or when I grew up. So speaking about those generations, silent generation, 1925 till 1942, that's not my generation. My generation was the baby boomers, 1942 to the early 1960s. Generation X was 1960s to 1980s. Generation Y, 1980s to early 2000s. Generation Z, early 2000s to the present day. And there's some argument about, the cut-off points and, where these generational groups actually start and end. But there's rough agreement on them being that these are the actual generational groups. Generation Y and Z share a lot of similarities. Most of the people that you have in your boarding residence will be Generation Z young people. So let's have a look at them. They've grown up with phones and the internet. They're highly connected. They call them digital natives. They know more people from many different cultures, and they're comfortable with people from different cultures. Most of them have both parents working. And for the first time, this group will earn less than their parents. Generation Z, long-term unemployment is an issue. Many experience mental health problems, something like 2 in 10. And most common of these is depression and anxiety. 4% are Indigenous. So we just want to have a quick look at the developmental stages, or just the developmental stages that will affect your students or the cohort that's in your boarding residence. So early childhood is 5 to 8 years, middle childhood is 9 to 11 years, adolescence 12 to 18 years, and early adulthood 19 to 40 years. And again, there's disagreement on the actual cut-off dates and all that sort of thing. We do know that adolescence is, it starts with puberty, and so that is happening earlier for young people these days. There are universal needs for young people wherever they are around the world, and we all need to experience a positive self-concept. We need to experience success in what we attempt to do. We need to become increasingly independent, to develop and accept our own sexual identity, to give and receive attention, to experience adventure. And this is an interesting one, isn't it? To be accepted by people of different ages. So your peers, as well as those in authority or those who are older than you. When you look at developmental principles, there's a couple of things we need to take into account. Age is not a predictor of maturity. Most children do go through a predictable order, but ages when they do this will vary enormously. And so this means that we need to provide a choice of activities or multiple levels of difficulty within one activity for boarding recreation programs if we're going to address different levels of maturity. And the second thing is that growth may proceed at different rates in various developmental areas in an individual child. So a child who's advanced physically may be average in terms of mental ability and below average in terms of emotional and social growth. So a child may need different experiences in each of these areas, and so you can't look at a child who's physically big and think that they have a higher level of maturity or mental ability or a higher level of emotional or social growth just because they're big, because they're physically large, because this growth does proceed at different rates in each of these developmental areas. So I want to have a look at the adolescent brain. I'm going to talk a fair bit about the adolescent brain, or the brain of the young person, over the course of this qualification. So when a child is 6 years old, the brain is 90 to 95% of adult size. But during adolescence, there is significant growth and development. So unused neural pathways are pruned away, and necessary and important pathways are strengthened. And the prefrontal cortex, that the bit that we use for judgment and rational decision making, that is the last to mature, and you can see why that can be a problem. All right, let's have a little bit of a look at listening strategies. There are basically 4 listening strategies or types of listening. The first is appreciative listening, and this is just what the name implies, listening to enjoy the story, music, poetry, that sort of thing. Critical listening, this involves hearing what someone says, identifying key points, arguments, solidifying your opinion. This could be a debate, a lecture, a political speech. Empathetic listening. Now, this is the most important skill to have when working with a young person. Empathetic listening is used to hear and understand a young person, to help a young person through a problem, to solve conflicts, those sort of things. And then discriminative listening. Discriminative listening is when you look past the words to the underlying message, and this works best in person when you can look to body language, tonal changes, those sort of things. When we are thinking about how we listen to a young person, our own journey, our values, our opinions, biases, weaknesses, all of those things affect the way that we listen to a young person. All of those things are like a filter for the way that we listen, and they affect what we really hear and our reactions to what we hear. And so it's very important that we understand who we are, and what our values, opinions, that sort of thing are. And it's also important that we understand how that affects our ability to listen to a young person effectively in an impartial, non-judgmental way. So we need to self-reflect and say, what are my values? What do I feel strongly for? What do I feel strongly against? What are my biases and weaknesses? What are my triggers? And once we self-reflect, we think about who we are, then we can more easily listen to young people in that impartial way. When we talk about effective listening, these things are very important. Number 1 is to give your undivided attention. You cannot multitask or rapidly refocus. This sends a message that you're not interested or engaged. And you're probably like me when you're talking to someone on the phone and you can hear the tap of keys, you instantly think that person's not really focused on what I'm saying. So number 1, give your undivided attention. Number 2, be non-judgmental. Don't minimise or trivialise or laugh at the young person's issue. Just be non-judgmental. Read the young person. Respond to emotions. Observe and understand the emotions behind the words. Is the young person angry, afraid, frustrated, resentful? Respond to the emotion as well as the words. And this image is one of the St John's pods in Darwin. The pods are where a group of young people live. And here's another picture of the pods here during the day. They're very effective accommodation. Very unusual, they look great. Effective listening, be quiet. Often they don't need an immediate reply. Allow a bit of quiet after a question, and very often the young person will break the silence themselves and answer or offer a solution themselves. Just assure that you understand. ask clarifying questions, restate what you think the young person said so that you really do understand what they've said. And it's very important to be approachable. Young people are likely to come to you because you react in a non-judgmental way, and you're the person who helps them solve their problems. You're the person who keeps your emotions and reactions under control. So don't react or overreact to what's said. Sometimes young people will just say things to get a reaction. If we're communicating to build trust, there's a few things that we can do. The first is respect confidentiality, always be discreet, always keep confidences. And of course, the exceptions are mandatory reporting or situations where you have to report something for the young person's own welfare. You can share your experiences in a limited way. Say to a young person, well, look, that happened to me when I was young, and this is how I dealt with it. Obviously you don't go into all the gory details, but it's always helpful to share your own experiences with young people like that. And another way to build trust in communication is to admit your mistakes. If you've done something wrong or if you've made a mistake, to say sorry, and young people really appreciate that. Just coming back again to empathetic listening, this is receiving and interpreting the emotion and providing an appropriate response. This enables the young person to release emotions, encourages the surfacing of information, and it creates that safe environment. I want to have a look at a few strategies for youth communication. The first of these is to pitch to the group and not the individual. When I was growing up, it was exactly the opposite. You always pitch to the individual. So research identifies that the major influences in decision making for young people is their circle of closest friend. The average young person is unlikely to make serious commitment to something until they find out what their friends are doing. And this can be very frustrating, but it also offers incredible potential. So we use this, we pitch to the group and not to the individual. Another is to invest in presentation. In a media-saturated world, young people are ruthless at filtering information. They want messages to come to them with minimal written information, eye-catching colour, picture, music, and video, whatever. But they are not going to look at boring, uninteresting stuff. If your poster looks boring, they'll probably decide that it's not worthy of your attention. So you need to invest in presentation. I want to talk a little bit about rapport. Rapport is very important in the job that we're doing, and if you can't establish rapport with young people, then you're probably in the wrong job. So it is very important to get this balance right. And so it is a balance between being distant and uncaring and being, that's at one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is being over-familiar to informal. Rapport is somewhere in between, getting that balance right. So rapport is a friendly connection based on interest, trust, and a sharing of concerns. It's a good balance, not being over familiar, and it's these sort of things here: not being on their case all the time, not being over familiar or letting the students be over familiar, and these two things here particularly: a gentle, firm control and mutual respect. Gentle, firm control and mutual respect, and that image there is of the boarding residences at Jarrigan College near Cairns. So let's have a look at over familiar. What does that actually mean? Being over familiar is being excessively friendly, informal, or intimate, and it is crossing a boundary. Being over familiar is crossing a boundary. It's taking undue liberties. And if you are over familiar, students will lose respect. They may choose not to follow instructions. They may take undue or unacceptable liberties. It may develop into an unnatural or unprofessional relationship, and other adults and young people will look at your relationship and they will think that is just not right. There's something not right there, and you've probably seen it you may have seen it in some of your colleagues, you may have seen it in other places, but people who are just over familiar with young people. Once, when we were doing this training, a boarding supervisor came to us and said, look, I think I've been over familiar. In fact, I have. What do I do about it? And so you need to restore the balance. And you don't want to punish the young person because it's not their fault, and they need to know it's not their fault. It's essentially it's your fault, not their fault. You may have to admit to them, that you were a bit too free and easy or something like that, and that you're going to have to make some changes. And for a period of time, the pendulum may need to swing the other way to enforce that distance between you and the young person. So rather than the pendulum being over towards the familiar side, the pendulum will be swinging right back the other side where you're establishing that distance that creates that professional relationship. That small distance between the student and the supervisor is part of that professional relationship, and it's important to have that small distance. Rapport is not an accident. It just doesn't happen by accident. There are definitely people who find it easier to have rapport with young people, but rapport is developed by actions, and these are some of the actions. The first and probably most critical is respect. So respect for students, staff, for the organisation, and respect in the way you talk about students, staff and the organisation. Approachability. Students have got to feel comfortable coming to staff. Open, honest, consistent communication and consistency between what you say and do. Genuine caring, responding to them as individuals. A positive attitude, having a sense of humour and being open to other points of view. So all of those sort of things are about developing developing rapport with young people, and this is something that you can actively, proactively, intentionally do. Just go out and work at developing those bonds with young people, that rapport with young people. This unit requires that we look at contemporary Australian culture, and I found this rather interesting. What is contemporary Australian culture? And I found three pieces of written material. This one here is satirical, and I'm not going to read all of it. I'm just going to read you a little bit of this, and this is in your notes so you can look at it. Young people are lazy, narcissistic and dishonest. They do not do what they're told. They are slackers, sponges, bludgers who are apparently unable and unwilling to get or hold down a job. They cannot spell, they cannot read or write, they cannot name the capital of this country. They wear their pants hanging down around their asses, their undies on the outside, and they're always blasting crappy music through their earphones as they tweet YOLO swag, and so on and so forth. And you can see that, when you read that, it's a very satirical piece of work, but, you can probably identify with some little bits and pieces in there that definitely do remind you of Australian young people. This is from a 16-year-old girl, and she says this is what contemporary Australian culture is for her. And you can see the first one. We have a problem with binge drinking. We love sports like cricket and Aussie football. We're very laid back and so on and so forth. And you can read that. But that's another view on contemporary Australian culture, and that's from a 16-year-old girl. This third one is just the top 5 youth issues, and this is from an Australian Youth Affairs Coalition survey, and it's on contemporary Australian culture. And they said the top 5 youth issues were these things here. And can you see what the last one is? Binge drinking and alcohol-fueled violence. So binge drinking is an issue. Youth unemployment is a bit of an issue as well. When we look at contemporary Australian culture, we also look at the subcultures. Subcultures are distinguished by fashion, belief, slang, sometimes by vehicles, music genres, socio-economic class, gender, conformity, ethnicity, all those sort of things. And these are some of the subculture groups that we find in Australia, these ones here. These are what they say are the current city subgroups, subculture groups: emo, super geek, jock dolly, gangster, punk like, glamazon, hipster, techno bohos and techno bobos, lads, surfies, skaters, hall girls, sea punks, gym bros. And you can see that image there is of this phenomena that we call hall girls. And it's a very interesting phenomena, and you can read more about that on the internet or in these notes. So how do we approach subcultures? What should be our approach to subcultures in the boarding residence? The young person's made a choice about the subculture, haven't they? They've chosen a particular subculture for a reason. And that girl there's an emo, I think, trying to look sad even though she might be happy. And so what we need to do is we need to respect the young person's right to make those choices. It's really useful if you can learn a little bit about the subculture. If you've got a couple of emos in your residence, then find out what an emo is. What do they do? What do they look like? Why do they do those things? So that you know a little bit about them rather than just coming straight out. As we have heard some boarding staff, they'll come straight out and say, oh no, we don't like that stuff. We don't want them doing that here. We need to respect the young person's right to make those choices. But you can see in capitals here, but not if the choices are harmful to the young person, harmful to others in the residence, or if they breach residence rules. So that should be our general approach to subcultures. Not sure how much of an issue it is for you in your boarding residence. So we want to look a little bit at cross-cultural issues, and you've just done some of this in Unit 7, so I'm not going into too much detail. But for students with a culturally and linguistically different background, they have to cope with the language barrier, codes and behaviours that are hard to understand. Some may face discrimination, and some may have experienced past trauma and dislocation. That's very likely that that's happened to them. And they're more likely to be affected by negative economic and health outcomes, poor access to health services, those things. So how do we support these young people? We support them by self-reflecting and valuing the diversity that called students or culturally and linguistically different students bring to our boarding residence. So we're not just saying that we put up with these students or we cope with them or whatever. What we're saying is we value them because they bring diversity and a richness to our boarding residence. We should be accessing cross-cultural brokers, information, awareness training, anything that will help us to understand where these young people are coming from. Be vigilant and deal with discrimination in a sensitive manner so that both parties can learn. And this does happen in boarding. We see it happen all the time. If we deal with it in a positive, sensitive way, then both parties can benefit from that. And just provide any support that a called student needs to have a positive boarding experience. We want to look a little at youth-centred practices, and I'm just going to skim over this. There's a lot of material in this in your book, and I hope you'll look at that and read through it. This is very important. And, you're in a boarding residence where there are a lot of young people, and it's important that your practices are youth-centred. So this includes things like including young people in decision-making, and this is probably the most important one, empowering young people. Not doing everything for them, but actually empowering them. Observing boundaries all the time in your role, being informed about issues and interests of young people, confidentiality and duty of care principles, respecting young people's identities, culture and diversity, using sensitive, innovative approaches to deal with issues, being aware of young people's rights and responsibilities, understanding the developmental issues that young people face. So all of those youth-centred practices. Is probably more as well, but it'd be good if you could look at those and look at the detail of those in your books. I want to talk a little about power imbalance, and power imbalance is when a person has a position of authority over another that can significantly impact their life and environment. It can come from a difference in work status, age, gender, length of time within a group, and we have a power imbalance between us and the students. And there may be other power imbalances in the residence. There might be a power imbalance between some of the students and others of the students. So what do we do about it? How do we deal with it? The first is that we need to recognise that it exists. If it does exist, then recognise that it exists, understand the elements of that power, how does it work, what are the parts of it, accept that it affects a professional relationship, and then use power appropriately in your relationship with students. So that's how you deal with a power imbalance. The last part of this is about reflecting on our practice. So to reflect on practice means just these three things: thinking back on an action or a practice, come to a conclusion, and then change our practice if it needs to be changed. And often you'll probably think, you'll think back on something. So it might be an altercation or a fight in the boarding residence, and you've had to deal with it. So you'll think back on it afterwards. You might even journal it. It's good to journal if you're able to do that. You might come to a conclusion, and you might conclude that you did a good job. I'd do it exactly the same next time. And if that's what you've concluded, then that's fine. But reflective practice is very important in our role. Reflective practice promotes and supports learning. It changes practice in response to conclusion. It recognises all the very varied contexts, and it keeps others informed and updated. So I hope that you are able to engage in reflective practice. And that's it. Thank you very much.